It is 1 a.m. in Washington, 5 in London, and 2 on a Friday afternoon here in Seoul. I'm Moon Geun-hye. Here are the top stories making headlines at this hour. President Park Geun-hye will chair an envisioned presidential committee for unification with North Korea. This is a rare decision apparently made to show how deeply she cares about the issue. The most difficult and dangerous scenario for the U.S. troops would be a war on the Korean Peninsula. That is, according to the commander of the U.S. Army. And Japan's prime minister says his government will not revise a landmark 1993 apology to women forced to serve in wartime military brothels. We'll have those stories and more, but first let us begin right here in this country at the nation's top office. President Park Geun-hye will chair a new reunification preparatory committee that is expected to launch sometime in April. Senior Presidential Foreign Affairs Secretary Ju Chul-ki says President Park will chair the committee and some 50 people from the government and civil society will soon be named to serve as members. The committee, which was proposed by the president on the first anniversary of her term in office last month, will meet at least once every 3 months to set a direction for inter-Korean reunification and seek ways to prepare for the process. Meanwhile, President Park will embark on a week-long trip to the Netherlands and Germany on March 23rd. The presidential office of Cheongwade says the president will attend the 2014 Nuclear Security Summit in The Hague from the 24th to the 25th. Now there, she will be giving an opening speech as the leader of the previous 2012 summit host country. President Park will also hold the summit talks with Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte on the sidelines of the global event. She will then travel to Berlin to meet with both German Chancellor Angela Merkel and President Joachim Gauck. Now, the Korean leader plans to focus her state visit on strengthening ties with Germany and learning about reunification from the German experience. President Park has nominated a career judge to head the country's broadcasting and communications watchdog. Choi Sung-jun, a senior judge at the Seoul High Court, was nominated to chair the Korea Communications Commission Friday. The term of the current chair, Lee Kyung-jae, ends on March 25th. Now, in his 28-year career, Choi has served as the president of the Chuncheon District Court and the chief judge at both the Seoul Central District Court and the Patent Court of Korea. In its nomination of Choi, the presidential office highlighted his leadership and rationality. It will request a parliamentary hearing for some time next week. A top U.S. military official says any new war on the Korean Peninsula would be incredibly difficult and dangerous. His comments came as another official warned the ballistic missile threat posed by North Korea to the mainland U.S. has developed from a theoretical consideration to a practical concern. ARIRANG NEWS Kwon reports.
The United States has once again warned of the increasing threat posed by North Korea, saying a war on the Korean Peninsula, should it ever break out again, would be incredibly difficult and extremely dangerous. This, according to U.S. Army Chief of Staff General Raymond Odierno, when he was asked which part of the world would be the most dangerous to deploy U.S. troops in the case of future contingencies. Speaking at a forum at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Odierno stressed his worry about North Korea's miscalculations and the importance of U.S. support to South Korea. The latest comments by another leading U.S. military figure show the U.S. is growing increasingly concerned by the ballistic missile threat posed by North Korea. At a Senate hearing Thursday, General Charles Jacoby, head of the Northern Command and North American Aerospace Defense Command, said that while threats to U.S. national security were becoming gradually more imperceptible, the U.S. military could make a confident assessment of where North Korea is in terms of ballistic missile capability.
Tangible evidence of North Korean and Iranian ambitions confirms that a limited ballistic missile threat to the homeland has matured from a theoretical to a practical consideration.
He added that his agencies were working with the Missile Defense Agency to deal with the potential proliferation of dangerous technologies to other states or terrorist groups. North Korea has developed and tested a number of short and medium-range missiles, including a series of Scud missile and short-range projectile firings in recent weeks. But analysts have generally discounted claims the regime has the capability to construct a miniature nuclear device for intercontinental ballistic missile delivery. Experts worry that if Pyongyang does possess such technology, the regime will pose a much greater security threat to South Korea, Japan, and the United States. Kwon So-ah, ARIRANG News.
Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe says there are no plans to revise the landmark apology Tokyo issued in 1993 to the so-called comfort women. But the sincerity of his remarks are unclear as they come just a day after one of his most trusted aides outright denied Japan's sexual enslavement of Korean women during World War II. Our Hwang Sang-hee reports.
Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe says Japan will uphold a landmark apology issued to the victims of its wartime sexual enslavement. Speaking at a session of the House of Councilors Budget Committee on Friday, Abe said the Kono statement contains Tokyo's historic perception on the so-called comfort women issue. He added his administration has no plans to revise it, as declared earlier by his Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshihide Suga. The Kono statement, released in the name of then Chief Cabinet Secretary Yohei Kono in 1993, acknowledges and apologizes for Japan's forced sexual enslavement of roughly 200,000 women during the Second World War. The Japanese government had declared earlier this month that it would probe the accuracy of testimonies provided by Korean comfort women, which established the basis of the statement. The move had raised speculations Japan was attempting to backtrack on its apology. Abe, who has long called for a review, seemed to take a step back Friday, saying historical perceptions should not become a diplomatic issue and said history studies should be left in the hands of experts. In Japan, more than 1,300 Japanese historians have signed a petition calling on their government to preserve the Kono statement as it is. Abe faced criticism both at home and abroad for denying his country's wartime crimes. The United States has been calling on Japan to mend ties with South Korea, indicating he may have been pressured to show a change in position. But while the Japanese leader may appear to have eased his right-wing stance, his comments come just a day after his top government spokesman said there was no evidence of Japan's forced recruitment of women. Hwang Sang-hee, ARIRANG News.
Now, Saturday marks the 2-year anniversary of the ratification of the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. Data released by the Korean government on Friday shows the deal has had a generally positive effect on the nation's trade figures. Our Na Hyun-kyung reports.
The Trade Ministry says Korea's exports to the U.S. have increased by 10% since the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement took effect 2 years ago. Exports of industry goods benefiting from the FTA, such as automobile and petroleum products, saw a 15% increase over the past 2 years compared to 2 years prior to ratification. That's more than a double of Korea's overall exports over the same period. But imports from the U.S. shrank nearly 4% overall, despite a 10% surge of American imported goods benefiting from the pact, like medicine and medical supplies. One area offsetting overall U.S. imports was agricultural products, the sore spot that caused much opposition from Korean farmers, delaying the ratification process in 2012. Compared to 2011, imports of American agricultural goods last year showed a 20% decrease, according to the ministry. A report released by the Korea International Trade Association on Friday says a gradual recovery in the world's largest economy will help boost Korean exports in the future. The report also advises Korean companies to focus on products that are increasingly in demand in the U.S. market, for example, biodiesel products and lighting equipment. At a forum held in Washington Thursday local time, U.S. lawmakers also positively evaluated the effects of the FTA, saying it has strengthened not only the two countries' economic ties, but also their political and military alliance. But reports say there were also critical voices from American civil organizations. Citing the decreased U.S. export figures to Korea, they say the deal has fallen far short of job promises and improvements in trade balances. Na Hyun-kyung, ARIRANG News.
to something deeper and long.
All of the day's important events close to home and around the world. Join Moon Gon-yong live from Seoul.
Mobile shopping market for the dual use of the Korean name East Sea and the Japanese name Sea of Japan in school textbooks in the state of Virginia. The government of Malaysia has denied that the plane that's been missing for days could have flown for 4 hours after it went off the radar. And a new report saying the plane's communication systems may have been shut down manually given rise to the possible of a hijack attempt or a technical malfunction. Connie Kim has the details.
The Malaysian government has denied claims that a missing Malaysia Airlines plane could have flown for hours after it lost contact with air traffic controllers following reports that emerged Thursday.
As far as Rolls-Royce and Boeing are concerned, those reports are inaccurate.
Investigators said that the plane may have flown for about 4 hours after it disappeared from radar because a satellite picked up faint electronic pings from the aircraft after it went missing. There were reportedly about 5 to 6 pings detected, with the pings detected every hour. Still, officials say it is hard to know where the jet was headed and where it was before it went down. In a related development, there is also a new claim that the plane's communication systems were shut down systematically. 2 U.S. officials told ABC News that the plane's 2 communication systems, the data reporting system and the transponder, were shut down at different times, indicating a third party may have intervened to shut them down. With a jetliner gone missing for 7 days, U.S. officials are now widening their search for the aircraft to the Indian Ocean and are considering the possibility that the plane flew west after takeoff. Indian defense officials have decided to deploy ships, aircraft, and helicopters to the Bay of Bengal and the Andaman Sea to search for debris. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 took off from Kuala Lumpur on Saturday, but vanished from radar en route to Beijing. Connie Kim, ARIRANG News.
1 person was killed and over a dozen injured Thursday when rival demonstrators clashed in Ukraine's eastern city of Donetsk. Ukrainian officials said the 22-year-old man died of a knife wound and the others are in hospital. The violence erupted as pro-Russia demonstrators clashed with crowds condemning Moscow's seizure of Crimea. The death is the first since Russia's takeover of the autonomous region. Nearly 100 people have been killed since protests broke out in Ukraine last November over the ousted president's decision to back away from a trade deal with the European Union in favor of closer ties with Russia. Meanwhile, Washington warned Russia on Thursday that the U.S. and Europe will take serious steps if it annexes Crimea, which is to hold a referendum this weekend on rejoining Russia. Meanwhile, over in eastern Harlem, New York City, search teams have found an 8th body amid the rubble of the explosion that leveled 2 buildings in New York City on Wednesday. The death toll is expected to rise even further as rescuers are fighting near freezing conditions to sift through the 3-story pile of bricks and twisted metal where apartment blocks once stood. More than 60 were injured. Investigators suspect it was a gas leak that caused the blast, though the possibility of a stove being left on is also being considered at the moment. They are also considering whether there is a connection between the explosion and a water main break nearby. On a very different note, Korean cuisine is often defined by its hot, spicy dishes, but people in Korea also have quite the sweet tooth. It's that hankering for cakes, pastries, and cookies that has more and more businesses bustling for their slice of the pie. Shin Se-min reports.
Chocolate cones filled with choco balls, a pearly whipped cream cake with raspberries on top, and itty-bitty bite-sized candies. This is but a small sample of the types of desserts that are literally selling like hotcakes in Seoul these days. At a department store in the capital, long lines form in front of this dessert shop as soon as it opens, and everyone is waiting for a taste of sweet bliss.
Only those who are prepared to stand in line and wait at least half an hour will be then able to satisfy their sweet tooth. And this particular shop usually closes at around midday after all their products have sold out.
I hear that this dessert is popular, which makes me want to stand in line and wait. I came out a little early so I could get a piece before the store runs out.
These customers are hardly alone. Desserts are the latest food craze in Korea. Though some desserts range in price from $4 all the way up to 50, consumers don't seem hesitant to open up their wallets.
Sometimes I spend less on my meal and just get desserts because these are a little pricey compared to the size. I even replace my meal with desserts sometimes.
Sales at this particular department store chain came in at nearly $84 million in 2013, surpassing sales of pre-made meals. Korea's leading dessert cafe franchise, which is owned by one of the nation's conglomerates, says its business has grown by 20% annually on average since it opened in 2002. Mom-and-pop stores are also getting in on the act. Experts say the rise in demand for desserts is partially due to the economic downturn as consumers crave sweet treats to lift their spirit in a sluggish economy.
More are willing to spend extra on things they categorize as valuable or worthy enough to invest in, such as pieces of cake, while also demanding cheaper prices on the things we buy daily. For instance, green peppers and potatoes.
As with the rapidly evolving market, the turnover rate for the department store's dessert shop is extremely high. The shops are on the short leases that only last 6 to 9 months, which puts more pressure on the industry to come up with the next popular dessert item. Shin Se-min, ARIRANG News.
It is Friday, which means it is time for our daily dose or weekly dose of Korean cinema. Well, Korean cinema is well known at home and abroad for producing films in a variety of styles that appeal to many different viewers. However, perhaps more than anything else, the local industry has made a name for itself by putting out some of the most famous revenge thrillers in recent years. For instance, in 2004, Park Chan-wook's Old Boy won the Grand Prix at the Cannes Film Festival. And 10 years later, revenge films are still a very big part of what makes the Korean film industry tick. And as we head into spring, a new batch of revenge thrillers is getting ready to enter theaters. And here to talk about the enduring popularity of revenge films in Korean cinema and the latest examples that are about to hit screens is, of course, our film critic, Piers Conran. Hello there, Piers.
Hi there.
So the revenge is the keyword today, and you're here to talk about that. Now, do you think revenge is still a very big part of Korean cinema today?
Absolutely. Since I came into contact with Korean cinema, which was around 10 years ago, my first Korean film was a revenge film. It was Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance, the first of the trilogy that's also comprised Old Boy. And since then, I've watched many Korean films, and a large chunk of those have always been revenge films. And all the time, the marquees are full of new revenge films. It's something that the industry doesn't seem to grow tired of.
You know, in your view, why do you think revenge is such a prevalent theme or such a big part of Korean cinema?
Well, I've wondered that many times myself, and I know many academics are trying to answer that question. And as someone who isn't Korean, it's a little difficult to answer it with a great deal of authority. But I would say that my impression is it has to do a lot with history. The history that Korea's undergone, particularly this idea of Koreans having had a lack of freedom from the colonial era of Japan, the Park Geun-hye and Chung Dong-hwan administrations. Korean citizens have often felt very kind of cloistered and not free to express themselves. And I don't think it's a coincidence that this trend of revenge has become more popular after the democratization of Korea in the 90s. And so we're seeing this pent-up frustration has finally come out. I think a lot of it has to do with personal loss as well. Many families, of course, were separated during the Korean War, or comfort women were used during the colonial period. And this sense of loss has kind of come out this way as well. So I think it's a very universal theme, but in Korea it's particularly prevalent, it seems to me.
It's more of that repression and sorrow coming out. I think in Korean we use the word han, and I could not find an English equivalent of that word, and I could not translate it in English. But that repression and that sorrow and the sadness and anger perhaps is vented out in such a theme, perhaps. Now, what are some of the most important examples that have stood the test of time?
Well, I mean, the most famous, of course, is Park Chan-wook's Vengeance trilogy, which began with 2002's Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance, continued in 2003 with Old Boy, and finished with Lady Vengeance in 2005. Three films that don't have a narrative continuity. They're completely different stories. Some actors play different characters in the different movies, but of course they carry the common theme of revenge. And there's many little quirks between them. There's little Easter eggs if you're looking very closely. Besides that, Kim Ji-woon's Bittersweet Life with Lee Byung-hun from 2005 is a very popular gangster revenge film. We also have Save the Green Planet, one of my favorites, which is a very oddball one from 2003. Or more recently, perhaps, there's the film Bedeviled, a small independent film that did very well in 2007.
You know, have any recent revenge films stood out for you? Not those, I suppose, the classics, if you will, but any recent ones?
Sure. There's always a bunch of revenge films, and while a lot of them are not very good, there are, of course, always a few very good ones. And among those is one was called Pluto, which was by a new director called Shinzo Abe. It's set in a high school, and it has to do with the kind of the pressures of having to succeed well academically. And one student takes revenge on other students who kind of try to trample on him. And it's very effective. It's a very good one. 26 Years is a very interesting film. It's based on a webcomic, and it's a fictional account of a group of people who are descendants of victims of the Gwangju massacre, and they set out to kill the former president, Chun Doo-hwan. So that's a very explicit revenge film, and something we wouldn't have seen 10 years ago.
Definitely not. I mean, I've seen this film myself, and what was interesting was that it could not find an investor. So this was actually made by average Koreans, am I correct?
That's correct. It was mostly crowdfunded.
Right. Now, would you say the theme of vengeance have more or less evolved over the years, even in Korean cinema?
Certainly. 26 Years, again, if I start off with that, is a really interesting example, because it's not a subtle film. It's very much about, you know, there was a perceived ill in Korean history, and this film kind of seeks to revise history and to kind of erase it. Whereas other Korean films were more subtle, more metaphorical. Also, what we're seeing a lot more these days is female protagonists taking on this revenge, because it used to be very much a patriarchal thing. So while that started with a film like 2005's Lady Vengeance, we're seeing more and more of it now, and a lot of that has to do with kind of these more darker kind of sexual abuse and things like that. And we're seeing a lot of that, and so it's going both ways now.
No, you know, if the industry keeps making these revenge films, there must be a market for them. So, you know, why have they remained so appealing, I suppose?
Well, revenge films, revenge narratives are appealing across the world. There's always a deal of empathy, audience empathy, when something happens to a character, and we follow them as they try and exact their vengeance. So we see a lot of that, and because of the obvious, the high emotions that come with that, and the very obvious kind of narrative machinations, it's very simple but very, very effective. And then also, of course, because of all the violence that we have in it, it becomes very much a genre, cinema spectacle. So there's many reasons that it works very well, but it works particularly well in Korea because melodrama is always very popular here. But when you add that kind of melodrama with the violence, there's something about that act of satisfaction when vengeance is carried out. It's both satisfaction and sadness, and there's always an enormous release at the end. And I think that's what's one of the aspects that has made it very popular for local viewers.
So last but not least, what are the new Korean thrillers that are heading to local theaters that we could look forward to?
Well, as I said, there's always a bunch of Korean revenge films that are not very far away, but at the moment we do have quite a few that are coming out. Just yesterday, the new film Monster came out, which stars Lee Min-ki and Kim Go-eun. Kim Go-eun has a lot to bear on her shoulders because she had a big debut in Eun-gyo a few years ago, and everyone's been talking about her. Now this film is from the same director who made Spellbound a few years ago. It's very, very violent, and I personally I can't say I'd recommend it very much. I think it's quite cruel towards women. But again, it's certainly a revenge film, follows many others. Later we'll be having Jung Jae-young's new film called Broken, which is based on a Higashino Keiko novel. That's a Japanese crime writer who's Also, there was Korean films Perfect Number and White Knight were also based on his books. That's a very standard revenge film. And then there's also one called A Hard Day, which is with Lee Sung-yeon and Cho Jin-won, which will be coming out soon.
So out of the three, if you were to recommend one for me, what would it be?
Well, I wouldn't recommend Monster, I'm sorry to say. Broken, I love the writer Higashino Keigo, and I like the actor Jung Jae-young, so the film may be good. I'm a little skeptical about it. It seems a bit simple. But then A Hard Day, I like the actors in it, and I don't know a huge amount about this film, but as the wild card, maybe I'll say that that's the one to look forward to.
Well, I will check those out and get back to you on that. Piers Conrad, thank you so much for today. We'll see you next week.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
And that is all from me at this hour. Thank you for watching. I'll be back with Business Today at 4 p.m. Korea time. See you then.